It really gives me a great pleasure for the Portage Route chapter to have another of our monthly Ida Johnson Memorial Lecture Series. And this month we have a gentleman coming to us from Tempe, Arizona. I heard him speak once in the Lewis and Clark Tri-Heritage Foundation annual meeting in St. Louis. I was quite impressed, and I asked him to come over, and he flew up from Tempe, Arizona. Our speaker is Professor Robert Miller. Robert Miller is an Eastern Shawnee. Where's Dugan? There's Dugan, who plays Juilliard, and Juilliard was an Eastern Shawnee also. So we have two Eastern Shawnees here with us. He teaches at the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law at Arizona State University in Tempe. He's a member of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And those of you that are not aware of the American Philosophical Society, but it houses some of the most valuable instruments in American history. All of the Lewis and Clark journals that Gary Moulton edited are found in the American Philosophical Society. It was founded in Philadelphia, and it was really the center of learning in the entire nation. And I think Bob told me that he was privileged enough to actually pick up one of the original journals and scan through it when he was with the American Philosophical Society. So he's the Willard Pedrick Distinguished Research Scholar. He's the director of Rosette LLP, American Indian Economic Development Program. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Robert Miller.
Thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here, folks. I'm also a little nervous because there's a lot of Lewis and Clark experts out here, so I'm going to start like a good lawyer with some caveats. I wrote this book 20 years ago, so I did it came out in 2006, but I did the research early on. And I'm a law professor, not a historian. So I'm delighted to speak here at the Interpretive Center because I'm going to be doing a little interpreting for you. And I hope presenting Lewis and Clark in an entirely different angle than you've ever thought of. And I added this title. What did we start out with? Just Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny. But as I started working on this last week, I had to look real professorial. So I had to look these words up. But that's a pretty fancy title. But what I'm going to argue to you, and you can be my jury, I am a lawyer, you can be my jury, and we'll see if I convince you at the end that Thomas Jefferson had his eye on the Oregon country, and Lewis and Clark were directed to go there to satisfy international law and strengthen the United States' claim to the Oregon country. At that time, there were 4 nations claiming the Oregon country: Russia, England, Spain, and us. And I'll get into that more, but he targeted the mouth of the Columbia River because of international law. Lee and I had a little bit of a debate today about the famous vote. Does everyone know what the famous vote is when they decided whether the expedition would live at the mouth of the Columbia River, where it was raining every single day they were there, or move 50, 60 miles upriver with very friendly Indians and with a very dry climate? So York, the enslaved person, got to vote. Sacagawea, the female, got to vote. I don't know if there was really a vote going on or if the captains were going to make the decision because Jefferson told them to occupy the mouth of the Columbia River. And it'll take me 2 hours, but at about the hour and 50-minute mark, I will convince you what this means. So I had just a few points. Let's see. So I'm giving you a new view of Lewis and Clark. I think this is the value of interdisciplinary research. The things I'm going to talk to you about have been written about by endless historians in more books than one can shake a stick at. But these were historians, and they didn't know the international law stuff that I'm talking about and the argument I'm making that Jefferson clearly had American empire in mind, the Oregon country in his targets. He wrote in his own writings that the United States, the descendants of Americans, would occupy this entire continent. He thought it might take many, many, many generations, but he plainly had this goal of a Pacific to Atlantic Ocean American empire. So let's get into this aspect of it. This is the part that I had a clicker a moment ago. We'll see if this works. And then, you know, I was in the used car business. I sold used cars before I went to law school, so I have brand new books to sell, and I hope you'll buy them so I don't have to take them back to Arizona with me. So what is the international law principle I'm talking about? Okay, well, we may do this manually. Did that move? Okay, it's frozen. It's going to be very hard if I don't have my outline. Can you help me, please? Maybe I did that. So let me take one further step back. So in 2003, the chief of my tribe called me and said that we had been asked by the National Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commission to be part of what was called the Circle of Tribal Advisors. And so, thank you very much. And so at first I told my chief no because I was an untenured law professor, and I thought, well, this bicentennial thing is all history, and I probably can't get tenure if I get involved. But here comes the joke, folks. I thought, well, I won't be here for the 300-year anniversary. This sounds like it could be fun. I better participate. So I called my chief back a couple days later. I said, has the tribe appointed anyone yet? No. I said, I'll do it. So starting in about June of 2003, I got on the COTA, Circle of Tribal Advisors. I then attended every national signature event, spoke dozens of times in the tent of many voices, if you remember that accompanied the voyage across the country back. But why I changed my mind and knew I could still write law was because I know this case here. This is the first United States Supreme Court case about Indian law. It's written by Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall wrote 3 Indian law cases that we call the Marshall Trilogy. And when you teach federal Indian law, you start with his 3 cases. This one is number 1. And so I asked myself, look at the date. So this is 20 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition left the D.C., right? D.C. area. And I thought, well, but Jefferson was a lawyer. I wonder if Jefferson knew the kind of international law of discovery, how European countries claimed the lands of indigenous peoples around the world and built empires. And I just took sort of a gamble. Now, I knew that Lewis and Clark weren't very good spellers, and usually people laugh when I say that. You remember they spelled mosquito 26 different ways. They couldn't even consistently misspell it. George Drouillard's name they misspelled multiple ways. But anyway, so I digress. But even these 2 guys that had very little formal training, I'm going to argue to you, they knew these international law principles. They knew what the United States wanted from them. They knew why Jefferson sent them where they did. And if you don't know this, Meriwether Lewis was Thomas Jefferson's private secretary, and the 2 of them lived alone in the White House for 2 years before Lewis left on the expedition. Lewis begged Jefferson to let him lead it. So I would argue to you that Lewis knew everything in Jefferson's mind. He knew the goal of the Pacific Northwest, of the Oregon country. So I'm going to describe this case as quickly as I can, and the international law aspects of the legal acquisition of overseas colonies, and that the United States has used these, and Chief Justice John Marshall used that international law in this famous case. So there, hey, it worked. What did this case hold? Notice I don't see any Indian's name. The plaintiff is an American, white guy. The defendant is an American white guy, but they were arguing over land that's now in Indiana. Who owned it, they said. Mr. Johnson's grandfather had bought this piece of land directly from an Indian chief out in the woods. Mr. McIntosh had acquired the land in 1818 by buying it from the United States, who had signed a treaty with the local tribes in 1813. And so the question the court had to answer is who had legal title to the land? Can Indian peoples sell their lands just to Mr. Johnson's grandpa, or can Indian lands only be sold to the United States through treaty and then the United States sells them. Well, Mr. McIntosh wins this case. The Supreme Court says this continent has been conquered and colonized through discovery and conquest. What did this discovery do to Indian peoples and indigenous nations? It limited their land rights and it limited their sovereign rights. And what this case held is that tribes somehow magically lost what you and I own in our homes, the fee simple absolute title. I don't know how much you know about Anglo-American property law, but when we buy a house, we are called the fee simple absolute owner. We can do almost anything we want with that land. We can sell it to anyone we want for any amount of money we can get. Tribes lost that legal right, that property right in the Anglo-American legal system just because a Spaniard or a Frenchman or an Englishman showed up with their flag and their cross and planted it in the soil. And this case held that the moment that happened, we'll talk about why in a moment, but Indian peoples and Indian nations lost some of their land rights. They now could only sell to this alleged discoverer, like they were lost. Who was lost? It was the explorers. It was, I think, Lewis and Clark. They knew their direction, but I think they were lost. What sovereign rights did Indian nations lose? This case is still law in the United States today. Tribes cannot sign treaties with foreign countries. They aren't even supposed to engage economically with foreign countries. They are limited to their contacts and workings with the United States government. That's why the topic I teach is called Federal Indian Law, because the feds have great power over tribal peoples and Indian nations because of this case and the Doctrine of Discovery. So I know this case, I taught it every single year, but as I start trying to write the articles I did, the research that ultimately became this book, I read the case about 30 times, and I did what lawyers do. We break crimes and torts down into their elements. Like if you run into my car out here and I sue you under Montana law for negligence, there are 4 elements of the tort of negligence I will have to prove to win money against him. So I just thought, well, okay, Doctrine of Discovery, that's what everyone calls it. Because of that case, Johnson v. McIntosh, folks, that's where the title, The Doctrine of Discovery, comes from. And so I just read it over and over and looking for, well, what are the constituent elements? So I want to give you these because I think Lewis and Clark really used all 10 of these elements in their work moving to the Oregon country. First discovery was all about the first European Christian country to find a new piece of land. The race was on to find islands and mainlands, put your flag and your cross in the soil and claim it. What Queen Elizabeth I added to this international law, did I catch your attention? Not Elizabeth II, but Queen Elizabeth I. In the 1550s, England considered this international law of discovery, and she made arguments, she and her lawyers, and they added the idea that just because you find it first, this island or North America, it's not yours forever. You have to you have to possess the area. And in a couple of moments, folks, I'm going to apply this to Fort Clatsop in the Oregon Territory. And I'm going to show you the Fort Clatsop Memorial, in which Lewis and Clark tell us why they built that fort and why they lived in it. And I have to extrapolate a little bit. I'm doing a little bit of interpretation, Madam Executive Director, but they were talking the Doctrine of Discovery. And that's what I'll show you at the end. And as my jury, I know you'll all agree with me. Well, what are the other 7 points I found? When a European showed up, and Thomas Jefferson knew this 100%. Madison knew this. Hamilton knew it. Our first Congress in 1790 passed a law about Indian lands that even had the word preemption in it. So what do they mean? And some courts call it European title. When a European showed up with their cross and their flag, Indians, you lost some rights here. We now have the rights. And what was the right? I'll take you clear back to what Marshall said. The Indian people's rights to sell their lands to anyone they want is now gone under American law. They don't have the fee simple absolute title like you and I do when we buy a house. Now, when did they consent to this? Never. Did they know of this? Never. Were they paid any money for the loss of this property right? Of course not. Okay, well, let's get back to my list of 10 things. Preemption. Literally, Lee's in that chair. None of us can sit in that chair now, right? So that's really all the word preemption means. European countries claimed a right to be the only purchaser of Indian lands, and they called this preemption. And our very first Congress put it into a federal law July 22, 1790. Indian title, what's left? The Supreme Court has used that phrase only 4 times. I've done the research, but state courts have used the phrase hundreds of times. What property rights did Indian nations still have? Well, they actually had a pretty valuable right still to occupy and to use the land, and as long as they wished to remain their homelands. Until they chose to sell by treaty to the United States, it was tribal nation land. So that's a pretty valuable right. But they did lose the right to sell. And I want to emphasize this right now while I'm saying this, or talking about Indian title. When Jefferson was president, he visited with many chiefs and delegations of Indians that came to the White House, encouraged by Lewis and Clark, because he had asked Lewis and Clark to send delegations of chiefs back east. And in the White House, he told them, your lands are your lands. You can live on them forever. But if you ever choose to sell, you can only sell to the United States. Now, isn't that the preemption aspect of the Doctrine of Discovery? In 8 treaties that Jefferson signed with tribes while he was president, word for word, if Tribe X ever chooses to sell its land, it can only sell to the United States. That is still the law today, folks. If you hear the phrase trust lands, I'm sure many of you have heard that. What does it mean when a tribe owns its reservation in trust with the United States? It means the United States is the legal owner, holds the title, the fee simple absolute title to Indian lands. All the tribe has is the use and occupancy right. And if you've done any Indian law like I have for 30 years now, tribes have to ask the United States for permission to develop their own lands, to lease their own lands. If they ever wanted to sell, they need the permission of the Secretary of Interior, because the United States is the legal owner of tribal lands. Citation to authority, I always ask my class, Johnson v. McIntosh. And in fact, 400 years before Johnson v. McIntosh. Johnson was old news by the time they wrote that opinion. What else happened to tribes? I mentioned this earlier. Tribes were not supposed to sign treaties with other nations, not even supposed to engage in trade with other nations. And I'm going to show you in just a few seconds. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State in 1792, he used this very point in arguments with the British ambassador, Sir George Hammond, about the Hudson's Bay Company being out in the old Northwest, the states today of Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, etc. Contiguity. I'm going to show you on a map in a moment. And again, Lee and you and I were talking about this today. Why Lewis went so far north. And what'd you tell me? It was called Camp Disappointment. I'll explain why. But he was trying to determine the drainage system, the western drainage system of the Mississippi River, because that's the boundaries under international law of the Louisiana Territory. And I'll show you a map in a moment. Terra nullius, Latin, it just means an empty earth. Of course, if land's empty, you can claim it. Just as if I find $1 over here, I'm going to pick it up and put it in my pocket, right? We learned that as 5-year-olds, didn't we? Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. Didn't we also learn that second one? Possession is 9/10 of the law. You didn't know it. 5 years old, you were learning international law, did you? And you couldn't even read my book at that time. Anyway, then I end up with 7, 8, and 9, the 3 C's. Conquest, military conquest, of course, acquired these Doctrine of Discovery rights. And what were the justifications, folks? Always, everywhere, not just in this continent. Europeans used it in Asia. Europeans used it in Africa. Europeans used it here. Indian peoples, indigenous peoples, let me use that phrase because it's applied in the entire world, are savages. They don't believe in the Bible, they don't believe in God, our God, etc. And these were used as justifications. So I took these 10 points from reading Johnson v. McIntosh multiple times. Okay, well, man, I'm really taking you back in time. So Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823, this international law is already over 400 years old. The international law of discovery really began with Spain and Portugal and the Catholic Church in 1436 and the Canary Islands, which you may know are just relatively off the coast there of Iberia, off Portugal and Spain, and a little bit off Africa. But once Columbus comes to the new, let me finish that thought. I'm trying to hurry because I got to get to the Lewis and Clark stuff, right? I see people going, international law, stop. In 1436, Pope Eugenius II granted the Canary Islands to Portugal to colonize, Christianize, and convert the wild, savage Canary Island peoples. Then in the 1450s, Pope Nicholas V granted Portugal rights to assume sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title, and to colonize, civilize, and Christianize the savage peoples of Africa. So this international law of how to colonize is really one of the earliest forms of international law there is, folks. The law of the sea, how to sail, where you can sail, was still in development in the year 1600 when Hugo Grotius wrote his book on the open seas, while the Spanish were writing books about, the closed sea. The Pope gave those to us. So what I'm now showing you is papal authority at that time that kings and queens had to pay attention to. So Columbus sails to the west, he finds new lands. What's the first thing he does? Spain sends the good guys in this story, Lee, the lawyers. The Spanish lawyers go to Pope Alexander VI and say, hey, you've been given Portugal all these colonization rights in Asia, etc., Africa. How about us? So in 1493, you can read that faster than me, but look at my elements of discovery. The Pope granted to Spain any rights in the West that were undiscovered by others. Well, what others did he mean? Because there were indigenous people living there. So he's talking other Europeans. Well, he even says it now, not if they were not previously possessed. That's my second element, folks, that I take from Johnson v. McIntosh. So when a European showed up, if they looked around and there were no other Europeans there, so I'm coming over to your yard tonight, Lee. Bob Miller flag, Bob Miller religious symbol, and I'm going to claim it. Okay, wonder how long that'll last. Well, the Pope then also, folks, what'd you learn in school? I'm going to mention at least 3 things tonight that we were taught just false stuff. Did Columbus think the earth was flat? Of course not. Did anyone think the earth was flat then? Well, apparently the Pope didn't, because in 1493 the Pope drew a line from the North Pole to the South Pole. How'd they know about that if they thought the earth was flat? But my most important point is everything west of that line was granted to Spain, and everything east of that line was granted to Portugal. And once again, you can see the religious aspect of it to convert these savages. Look at this map, folks. When I first started doing this research in 2003, I ran across what's called the line of demarcation. I didn't know anything about it. I hadn't studied international history per se. It's this line that Pope Alexander VI drew in 1493. See the dotted line? That's the line the Pope drew in his papal bull of 1493. But Portugal refused to comply and said, I'll go to war over it. So look up on the left, Spain and Portugal signed a treaty 1 year later at the Spanish city called Tordesillas, and they agreed to move that line 500 miles to the west to the bright red line. The entire world was divided for the colonization of Spain and Portugal under the authority of God or the authority of the Pope. Notice only after they rounded South America in 1521 and Balboa crossed Panama in 1513 did they find out there was this other little lake out there. And so then in 1529, Spain and Portugal sign a treaty in the city of Zaragoza, and they draw the line around the rest of the world. Now England, France, and Holland, they didn't care much for this line. And of course you know England and Holland were not even Catholic countries. Why did I mention Elizabeth I earlier? 1550s. She's excommunicated. She is a Protestant. Why would she care what the papal bull said? Think just for a second. Now, if this was a law school class, I'd call on one of you. We do the Socratic method. Ma'am, what? No, just joking. Nobody likes to be called on, but that's how we do it in law school. Now, where was I? What was my question, Lee? See how I get distracted? She wanted her English possessions and her English colonies to be recognized by Spain and Portugal and France and Holland. She didn't want war. They wanted to divide. You know, again, coming over to your house, Lee, you told me you owned a couple acres. This guy and I are going to come over. You take half his stuff, and I'll take the other half. Agreed? Sounds like a good deal to me. Just if we have bigger guns than Lee does. That's international law. Okay, I will press on. So the English, I wrote something else down because I was looking at this again today. I left stuff. England complied with the Doctrine of Discovery when their colonists started coming over here. Henry VII in 1496 sends the Cabot brothers exploring from Newfoundland, maybe as far south as modern-day Virginia. Every couple hundred miles, they'd go ashore. This is ours. We'll be back. That's Terminator. But when the colonial charters that our country comes from, folks, were issued, starting in Jamestown, 1606, King James I told his Virginia colonists to possess lands that are not occupied already by other Christians, but take them if they are not. So the Doctrine of Discovery and how to have empire and colonies were well accepted. I bring us to this royal proclamation. This pretty much led to our Revolutionary War because King George III drew a line along the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains. Anything west of that belongs to natives. And King George III said, my colonists cannot even go over there without permission from a royal governor of one of the colonies. If you know your Declaration of Independence really well, folks, this is one of the reasons Thomas Jefferson wrote that we had to break away from the king because he was restricting our property rights. Most people don't know this. All they know about the Declaration of Independence is the phrase about he has loosed the merciless savages on us. Obviously, that's about the native peoples. But almost nobody knows what that other complaint that we had against the king means when he said he has limited our property rights. He's talking about this. You remember George Washington, a surveyor? Where was he surveying these lands? What lands did he hope to buy on the cheap and speculate on? Indian lands. Jefferson and his father owned lands in the West too. Okay. So where am I? I've got to show this. We were talking about George. Who do you say our favorite George was? I thought you guys were talking about this. I cannot give a talk on any subject anymore without showing everybody this, folks. Be ready to maybe have a chill go down your spine. General George Washington is asked by the Articles of Confederation to give them advice about how to deal with the West and with native peoples. We just had signed our treaty with England ending the Revolutionary War. 2 years after the fighting ended in Yorktown. Took 2 years to finalize it. England says, you're a country, okay, we won't attack you, whatever. Now they asked General Washington for some advice. So he's saying, you can't talk about the Western lands. Here's where I wish I hate to, look at that, see why I didn't want to do that? Oh, I had a pointer, but no, there's no pointer. Look at that, he says, settlement of the Western lands and making peace with the Indians are the same topic. So he was already thinking about expansion at least to the Mississippi. And how do we do that with native peoples in the way? He said, well, it's cheaper to purchase their land than fight a war. Now, I underlined the stuff that I wonder what you think of that. I'll take a drink over. This is a 4-page letter that's called The Savage as the Wolf Letter, as you can guess. You can find this in the National Archives in 2 seconds on Google if you type in George and that date. This is on the last page. Look what he says. We're going to get Indians' land because they're going to retreat from us just like the wild animals do. But look at that next phrase. Both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. Yikes. Okay, Doctrine of Discovery, my talk on Lewis and Clark. Well, I guess it's probably a little relevant to Lewis and Clark, really. But anyway, I can't help but not show it. What did Thomas Jefferson know about this international law that I'm talking about? What did the other founding fathers? Hamilton was a lawyer. Hamilton sued for the state of New York and made discovery claims against Massachusetts. This idea of preemption and who owned rights and where boundaries were was well known. I've already mentioned this briefly. Oh, she said it was going to happen. I thought it was this thing. Oh, good, it's over. See, my talk was so hot. That actually worked good. Okay, Secretary of State, he's our first Secretary of State. He's in George Washington's cabinet, and he has to go argue with the British ambassador, Sir George Hammond, about the Hudson Bay Company and the Hudson Bay forts, and they're taking furs in territory that's now U.S. territory. They got to get out of there. They're trading with, and these are his words, our Indians. He considered that the United States, I don't know what, owned, I don't know. Subjects of the U.S., I don't know. But Jefferson was a good lawyer. Any lawyers in here? He wrote down, right there, sir, I was a lawyer, of course, practiced for 8 years before I became a prof. This is perfect. He wrote down in advance what he would talk to Sir George Hammond about. The moment he got home from the meeting, he wrote a letter back to Sir George Hammond saying, here's what we talked about, and he did a note to file. Do you still do notes to file? That's old times lawyering, but he put in a note, here's what I did. Here's the topics, the 3 topics I talked to Sir George Hammond about. They got to get those Englishmen out of there. Hudson Bay Company's got to move. Fort Detroit, they got to get out of there. That's in American territory. They're dealing with our Indians. We have the right of preemption there, and the United States is the only country that has the right to trade with those Indians. Now, does that sound like, do I need to go all the way back to Johnson v. McIntosh and my 10 elements? That sounds like some of what Chief Justice John Marshall wrote 30 years later. He told Sir George Hammond, we are the ones in control of trade with those Indians that are now within the borders that you recognize are ours, is the United States. When he's president, I've already mentioned this, he met many chiefs in the White House. In his administration, he signed 26 treaties with tribes in the 8 years he was president. And what did he tell the chiefs? You can read it in his own hand, his own minutes. Those lands are yours, they're yours forever. But if you ever want to sell, you can only sell to the United States. He even made the point, and some of the treaties did, you cannot sell to an American citizen or a foreign citizen or a foreign country. You can only sell to the United States. So the Johnson v. McIntosh case was kind of an open and shut case under international law because it was well known that Indians had lost that full fee simple ownership. Oh, folks, this is interesting. People say Jefferson wrote only one book, and that's correct. But after making the Louisiana Purchase, he went home the summer of 1804, and using his own library, which you know became the National Library of Congress, or whatever you call it, and he researched how big Louisiana was. And now we're getting to my element of contiguity. And one of the major tasks of the Lewis and Clark expedition was to find the boundaries of Louisiana. Now, you may not know this, but the United States sent 3 other expeditions throughout Louisiana. Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, I bet you know his name, he went up the Mississippi River. We were very discouraged to find out it ended in Minnesota. A mighty river like that we thought must have gone like to Japan or something with a flat earth, right? Okay. And then Zebulon Pike was sent along the Arkansas River. And lo and behold, he finds a mountain out there called Pikes Peak. What a coincidence. And then 2 guys I know you don't know, Dunbar and Scott, were sent by Jefferson along the Red River. And I'll show you the map in a moment, to try to find the boundaries, the contiguity element of the Doctrine of Discovery. So Jefferson writes a 40-page pamphlet called The Limits and Boundaries of Louisiana. That's what he spent the summer of 1804 doing in Monticello. And, probably hoping Lewis and Clark could get back soon and tell him the latitude and longitude everywhere they'd been. Oh, I love this, folks. Folks, we'll talk about this more in a bit. Once we make the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, Lewis and Clark aren't traveling through lands owned by another country. Spain, France. It became French again by a secret treaty in 1800. So it was French territory. But now President Jefferson writes a letter to Meriwether Lewis, who's spending the winter in the St. Louis area, and he's informing him about the Louisiana Purchase. He said, you don't have to deal with English, French, or Spanish. We have purchased that territory. And look at the quote. We are now the sovereigns of the country. Isn't that one of my 10 elements? But subject to Indian rights of occupancy. Isn't that the Indian title of my 10 elements of the Doctrine of Discovery? So Jefferson, I didn't say this earlier, but if you don't know, he was a full-time attorney from 1767 to 1774 when he went into politics full-time. And there are 2 books on his law practice and the 900 and some cases he handled in those 7 years. Half of them were land title disputes. How'd you get the title originally? Are you the legal owner, Virginia colonists, of this land? And so the authors of these books say that Jefferson would have known all about colonization, international law, and how you only get the title through either the United States or through the Commonwealth of Virginia. Yes, ma'am.
Is Christianity still playing a role in these discovery policies, like the way it was in your element to discovery slide?
Well, let's look ahead, because I don't know what's coming next. See, this is the value of PowerPoint. When I get lost, I hit the button again. The United States has seemingly downplayed this, but there's still, what were the boarding schools about, folks? Your parents met at boarding school. My mom went to boarding school in Oklahoma. It was to Christianize Indian kids. And so there's no question that American history. Lewis and Clark, did they emphasize it much? I don't think so. But anyway, okay. Here's the piece de resistance. In 1808, look at the letter Jefferson, president, writes to the Senate. We have to buy the land in the Louisiana Territory from the, isn't it a quote, native proprietors? I looked up a 1808 dictionary. Proprietor meant the same thing then as it does now. Jefferson, as a lawyer, understood these international law principles. He knew what rights the United States had acquired. And I'm going to tell you something that might stun you, folks. And I think I saw it in an exhibit out here, Sarah, so you need a footnote. We bought 800 million acres for 4 cents an acre. That's false. What did we buy from France, folks? Think a moment. What did we buy from France? What did France hold out there? It held the power of preemption, the right to be the only purchaser. It did not own probably even a single acre of land. There might have been, St. Louis was there, St. Genevieve was there, New Orleans was there. There were some French military posts, mostly still Spanish, were there. But what they own across the whole? Nothing. Who owned it? Who lived there? Who had the rights to it? The native peoples. And you also already know, the 100 years after the Louisiana Purchase, what did the United States do? Signed more than 100 treaties with the tribes in the Louisiana Territory. And one very famous Indian law professor, scholar, wrote an article in 1947. He estimated the United States paid the tribes over $300 million in those 100 treaties to buy now the actual fee simple absolute title to the lands. So if there's one thing, just every article, every history book repeats this canard. Oh, I love saying that word. It just came out of nowhere. 3 cents, or I see in your exhibits now people are saying we paid 4 cents an acre. That's what we paid France for the preemption power. We bought the land from the Indian peoples. And folks, what do you know? Those 100 tribes are still out there, aren't there? There's 100 reservations in so we didn't even buy all the lands. The tribes still own a lot of it. And guess what? The United States is still paying for the Louisiana Territory because a lot of these treaties demand ongoing obligations on the United States. So we're still paying for the Louisiana Purchase, so the price is going up. It must be 5 cents an acre now. No, it's way more than that. Okay, let's get to Jefferson and Lewis and Clark. Jefferson is terrified of what the English are doing. Alexander Mackenzie, if you all may know, 1792, 1793, he crosses Canada. Jefferson was terrified. He found the Columbia River. Stephen Ambrose's book, I think that's where I researched this or read about it. They laid out Alexander Mackenzie's map and got on their knees in the White House. Where did he go? What did he find? Thank God he only found the Mackenzie River. And he came out in British Columbia at Bella Coola, quite north. So the Columbia River was still available to find, I guess. So he sends a secret message to Congress. It's all about England, but he does not use the word England because he's afraid he'll provoke, invasion again. He asks for them to fund an expedition. And he tries to tie it to a constitutional power that Congress has to spend federal dollars. The Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of our Constitution. And so what does Jefferson say? We will open the fur trade. He says we'll steal it from that other country to the north. He doesn't want to say the word England in this message, but I wonder what country to the north is doing fur trading. Fools me, I don't know. I have the word British there, but he didn't say that. He said we'll explore even to the Pacific. We'll learn the geography. We'll learn how to conduct trade out there. Let me tell you, folks, the most lucrative economic activity in the world at that time was the fur trade to China. And he was thinking fur trade. Get rid of the British, the Hudson Bay Company, etc. Get a post on the Pacific. And that's what Americans are doing. Captain Robert Gray, I'm getting ahead of myself. He's the first supposedly European/American that ever saw the Columbia River. What was he doing there? Sea otter trade, taking the furs to China. It was the most lucrative thing, and this is why he told Congress it was worth doing. He told them, you can use your Commerce Clause power. I haven't given this talk in a long time, but I think this is right. He said that the expedition would cost $2,500. And like any federal project, it had a little bit of an overrun. And I'm blanking, I think it cost about $18,000. So just 9 times, 7 times, I don't know. Look what he told Congress we will do. We will talk with the natives. We will learn what they want, what kind of goods they want from us, and what kind of furs they'll trade for us. Where will we open fur trading posts? Let me take you back a step, folks. George Washington, as president in 1795, got Congress to enact the Indian Trading Act. And we created and ultimately operated 28 federal trading posts across the Indian frontier. So trading with tribes was old news by 1803 when he says, we'll trade with these tribes now in Louisiana Territory. So what are his instructions to Sarah, I took a picture of you, have the one instruction out there, but it's only one. So Jefferson gave Lewis 3 instructions in this letter, and I'll show you the 4th one he gave Meriwether Lewis after we made the Louisiana Purchase. Find the Northwest Passage. Again, what was the primary target and goal was quick shipment of furs to some port on the Pacific and getting it to China. Open commerce and trade with the Indians. Now, this is the letter of instructions he wrote Meriwether Lewis. Here's what you're doing. Here's the task I'm assigning you to do. 3 things. And of course, what do we learn in school? I said earlier, what did you learn in grade school Lewis and Clark were doing? Flora and fauna. Flora and fauna. Okay, Jefferson was interested in that stuff, sure. Maybe he thought he had to sort of hide that from Congress because Commerce Clause power is why he said Congress had the authority to appropriate federal tax dollars to pay for this. But was it a frolic? No, it was not a frolic. And tribes, I'll mention this in a moment, but the tribes were heavily part of his scientific, sociological goals. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Does anyone disagree with this? Without native peoples, Lewis and Clark would not have succeeded. Probably would not have survived. Out here at Lemhi Pass and Lolo Pass, I am certain those guys would have tried to cross And if they hadn't had Indian horses and Indian guides, they surely all would have died. A sign you showed me today, Lee, or was that maybe out here just before, Clark wrote, "The men are determined to succeed or perish." Without tribal help, tribal food, tribal guidance, tribal horses, they wouldn't have succeeded. They might have had to turn back, or they might have died in the attempt. And gosh, those Indians should have killed them. I'll talk about it. Do you know at Nez Perce, when they stumbled out of the Bitterroot Mountains, the guys were so weak and so sick and so starved, the Nez Perce looked at the rifles they had, the beads and trade, needles and just whatever, and the Nez Perce discussed killing them. And the oral history of the Nez Perce people is that a woman, Watkawis, said, "Do them no harm," because she had been captured and been enslaved, I guess, in Canada, but had been treated well and returned, I guess, by some Canadians. And so she told, and the tribal leaders, I guess, listened to her. Because think of that treasure hoard of guns and stuff. And these guys are puking their guts out and laying on the ground, can't even move. The journals say something, Lewis couldn't even sit a horse for over a week, he was so sick. Okay. And could the Mandans have killed? Yeah, okay. Okay, Louisiana Territory tribes. Oh, folks, Lewis and Clark took 21 numbered bundles of gifts for tribes they knew they were going to encounter. So I'm getting back to what was the purposes, and that Indian, what we're taught in school, flora and fauna, is just not the full story. Jefferson said, make friends with the Teton Sioux. They knew enough that the Tetons controlled the Missouri, charged tolls for people that passed on the river, and were a worry. And obviously Jefferson knew the Mandans were great corn farmers, because sent them a metal corn grinder, which they probably broke up for the metal. You and I were talking, I think Ambrose talks about that, or maybe Rhonda's book. Here's where Jefferson said, convince chiefs to come back and visit. He wanted the chiefs to see how powerful and big the United States was. Some chiefs returned and they said they're more numerous than the stars of the heavens. And what I've read is they weren't believed. And they said they live on top of each other. So I guess they meant, New York City apartment. I don't know. But Jefferson had those kind of ideas too. He also wanted Lewis and Clark to take vocabularies and questionnaires. If you've never heard of these vocabularies, Jefferson was going to spend his retirement studying these vocabularies that Lewis and Clark had taken and other ones that he had acquired. And some yahoo stole his trunk on his ship home and threw it overboard. There are very few, if any, of these questionnaires still in existence. I have seen at the APS like one-page muddy, and I don't think it was a Lewis and Clark one. Lee mentioned, since I'm mentioning the APS, so I've worked with the APS since 2006. The librarian takes me in the vault, and he gives me the red-bound Lewis and Clark journal. And I go, shouldn't I be wearing gloves? And he goes, no, those are even more dangerous. I got to hold, I don't get to, I'm not a Clarkie, if you guys know what that is, but my God, this thing's 200 years old. These guys wrote this by the campfire as, okay, that was pretty dramatic. Anyway, so that's where they're at, because President Jefferson was the president of the American Philosophical Society for 17 years, overlapping those measly little 8 years he was president of the United States. So that's one of the primary reasons he deposited so much of Lewis and Clark's stuff at the APS in Philadelphia. Now these questions, so the vocabularies, what's your word for dirt and sun and horse? And Jefferson was going to study this stuff to compare. But the questionnaires were not so innocuous, folks. If you read those very carefully, the report that Lewis and Clark send from Mandan in probably January 1805, February, they send some of the crew back to DC. They take some wild animals, alive animals and plant specimens. And they took back this questionnaire that had been filled out so far. How many warriors do you have? Who are your enemies? Who are your allies? How do you fight? So some of this looked like what we might call military intelligence today. Again, those Indians should have, Okay, we buy Louisiana. So folks, You may wonder why. I've already talked, there's a second set of instructions yet to come to Meriwether Lewis. When Jefferson was first planning the expedition, he asked England, France, and Spain for passports for Lewis and Clark. And he lied to them and said, this is only about flora and fauna. And we already know he was thinking of stealing the trade from England. That's what he told Congress, plainly, and opening the trade with tribes, so we know he lied. But they were crossing territory that maybe belonged to those other three countries, so he got passport. Spain was smart enough and refused to give him passports. Do you all know that Spain sent out 4 military expeditions to try to arrest Lewis and Clark? Do you all know that Lieutenant Zebulon Pike spent a month in a Spanish prison when he was captured, headed to Pike's Peak? Anyway, I digress. But Lewis left D.C. on the actual expedition. I could be way wrong on this. But anyway, the news of the Louisiana Purchase arrives in D.C. on or about July the 4th. It's a whole new story. My goodness, we don't need those passports anymore. It's a new objective for Lewis and Clark. It requires a new letter of instructions because Lewis and Clark didn't know this had happened. So here's the second letter of instructions that Jefferson wrote. June the 20th, which you guys have on your wall out here, only the first one. You're going to have to add the second too. This one. Now, he writes to Lewis, he says, you don't need those passports. We have purchased that area. We are the sovereigns there now. France and Spanish rights are gone. They're gone. You tell those tribes, we're the new kid on the block. And they did. But again, he said, make friends of the powerful Tetons. I told you I'd show you a map. Every growth of the United States, folks, is based on international law, the Doctrine of Discovery. These treaties we signed that settled these areas with other countries, it was us, it was you and me dividing Lee's house up, right? Let's do that on a treaty, and let's get the lawyer here to notarize it. And maybe he should draft it for us so we know it's all cricket, proper. You and I were talking about Cape Disappointment today. I wish I had a pointer, folks. Do you see, so what, the Marias River, is that what you told me, Lee, is the one that goes up north there, that little billop? Anyway, contiguity. Billip, but you don't know what that, I don't know what that word means either. I think I just made it up. That little blip up at the top. So I didn't explain what contiguity means, folks. Under international law, finding the mouth of the river was the key. And you now had a claim to the entire drainage system. It doesn't matter how long that river might be. That's why we were unhappy that the Mississippi ends short of Canada today. That's why Lewis was told to go find the headwaters and then to also explore how far north. Any of the drainage systems attached to the Missouri, where were they? So Camp Disappointment is way up there. They spent, what, an entire week there, didn't they, Lee? It was cloudy every night, and that's why they called it Camp Disappointment, because they couldn't do that sextant think and the octant. He taught me all this stuff today. I may have to pay you for coming here. Well, don't say that. I did. Can you strike that from the recording? But we didn't realize that a little bit of the drainage system went up above. So contiguity, folks. Look at the Oregon country. What's the definition of the Oregon country? Drainage system of the Columbia River. How good's your history? In 1844, what was James K. Polk's campaign slogan? 54, 40, or fight. Huh? Today, nobody knows hardly what he meant. Do you think that he ran with a campaign slogan that no one knew what it meant? Well, of course not. So every American alive in 1844 knew what he meant. He was demanding the entire British Columbia to the 54th degree of parallel latitude, which is the southern tip of Alaska today, and all of British Columbia because of contiguity. Because of this international law element, you have the rights to the entire drainage system. And he was threatening going to war with England because of that. I lost something, didn't I? Here it is. But anyway, just take a look at that map. So the Red River is where Dunbar, I don't think I said those guys' names, did I? Jefferson sent Dunbar and Scott along the lower yellow, and Zebulon Pike went along the Arkansas and to the north, and of course Lewis and Clark go to the west. Okay, Lewis and Clark conducted about 50 2- and 3-day diplomatic conferences, councils with Indian tribes that they encountered. They prepared for this very carefully. You can read today in the journals the 2,500-word speech they delivered to every tribe they encountered. I had the date here just to show you that I really know my stuff. I had to do this research. I had to read my own book today. Told you, it came out 17 years ago. Okay, where'd that date go? August the 3rd, 1804, they meet their first tribal encounter with the Oto Indians in what's now Missouri. And Lewis writes a letter to an Oto chief who was not there. And so we can read that letter, 2,500 words. Clark copied it a few months later on August the 30th, 1804, when they held their second tribal council with the Yankton Sioux up in what's now South Dakota. And Clark wrote, "This is the speech we gave to everybody." So we know exactly what they told the tribes. The French and the Spanish are gone. They sailed across that great sea never to return. We are your new fathers. And that's exactly how they worded it. They showed those peace medals. See this Thomas Jefferson? He is our chief. He is your new chief. You do what he says, things will go well with you. You ignore what he says, we will consume you like the fire consumes the grass of the prairie. That's a quote. Welcome. Glad you came over to my house. Jeez, that guy's tough. But remember the numbered bales to give gifts. What were they doing, folks? They were traveling salesmen. They were showing natives the goods Americans could sell them, and they wanted furs in trade. Where do you want to post? Yankton Sioux or Oto Missouri tribe. Where would it be the most convenient place? Which river? Where should we build it? Where can you get furs? What kind of American goods do you want? That's what they were doing. They distributed the Jefferson peace medals. If you've never seen one, I have a photo in a second. They had 3 different sizes. Whew, boy, it's been a while since I gave this talk. I think 75 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 30 millimeter, and depending on if you were Chief 1, you got the big one, Chief 2, middle one. Lee, you've got one? Whew, a real one? Oh.
I don't know if it's real or not.
Well, I hope it is.
No, it's not.
Can I buy it from you for $5? I'll give you 6, top dollar. They handed out military uniforms and U.S. flags, and they thought that when Native peoples took it, they were accepting the sovereignty of the United States. One of the funny passages in the journals is Clark and Lewis go to a Mandan lodge. Maybe it was a Hidatsa lodge. They're proud because the American flag is flying out front of the lodge. But they write in the journals, we went inside and the Spanish flag's hanging on the wall. So they started telling Indians, you have to give us those, and you can't take those anymore. There were still Hudson Bay traders in the Mandan villages, and Clark had a very stern talk with him. You can read this in the journals. I told him this was American territory now, and he's got to get out of here. And he absolutely better not be giving these sovereignty tokens. That's what historians call these folks, call these things, folks, sovereignty tokens. And if the tribes took it, the Americans thought they were accepting American sovereignty. You showed us and talked to me about the air rifle today, folks. Downstairs is the air rifle. Lewis and Clark, part of these 3-day diplomatic missions, they would parade and march and shoot, and the air gun is what just impressed the hell out of Native peoples. No sound, no smoke, boom! Or no sound, I said no sound. But a bullet, shoots a bird or shoots a target. And so if you guys haven't seen go downstairs with him and get a lesson. So we were trying to, which side am I on? Yeah, see, I foot in both worlds. So yeah, I'm an American, but I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe, so I better pick one side. Formal speeches, Spanish and French gone, you're now our children. Send some of your chiefs back to DC, meet the president, turn in other nations' sovereignty tokens. This is what these guys were doing, pursuant to Jefferson's orders. And especially now that January, I've forgotten the date, January 1804 letter, after the Louisiana Purchase, no French, no Spanish. The United States is the only country with sovereign powers with these international law rights to buy lands, etc. Here's a peace medal if you've never seen it. They made these for over 100 years, mostly for the Indian trade. If you're ever in St. Louis, go under the arch. There's an exhibit there of every presidential peace medal. They made them as late as 1893. They even had ones of Washington. So for over 100 years, we had these. Peace and friendship. Yeah. If we give you everything we have. So what time is it? I said, and if there's questions,
8:02.
8:02. I only have an hour more, so folks. So, are there any questions right now? Be a perfect, if anyone wants.
There is a question that is on Zoom.
Okay.
Bear with me as I read it.
They're asking how to turn on the link.
No, it's a gentleman. It's a long one. Give me a second.
Well, why don't you read it and Reader's Digest it for me? Hey, if we say that, we know we're of a certain age. If we know what it means, the Reader's Digest, right?
Do you feel that the manifest destiny doctrine to occupy more land was the #1 goal for Jefferson over finding the Northwest Passage, discovering flora fauna of the West, and determining the boundaries of the Upper LA? And then he goes on to says, I think we know your answer, but it's okay to answer the question anyway. We'd love to hear your talk like attorneys talk.
Forthwith, heretofore. Is that what they meant by attorney talk?
Yes.
I mean, Jefferson wanted all those things. The value of the Oregon country was incredible, but the value of the fur trade to American economy, you know, we were a debtor, whatever you want to call it, nation to England and Europe. Do you folks know that our early cotton trade, we were just a raw supplier for the English industry. So we were kind of like a third world country for quite a while. So we wanted to improve lots of things. Okay, specific encounters. Meeting the Mandans and Hidatsas helped them get through that winter. Some of you, almost none of you probably know this, but Lewis and Clark were literally the beginning of the war trade. What do we call that when we sell material goods? There's a bad phrase for that, right? But Lewis and Clark had their smiths with them, and they started making war hatchets, because that's what the Mandan and Hidatsa wanted to buy. Protect themselves from the Assiniboine Sioux that raided them occasionally. And so they're selling corn to Lewis and Clark. The corn helped them through the winter, maybe to survive. Some people have written that. They wouldn't have survived without Mandan corn. And they're making war hatchets. And does anyone in here know that one of those war hatchets beat Lewis and Clark to Nez Perce country? Did you know that, Lee? That's a pretty obscure Lewis and Clark fact. How did that hatchet beat them across the Rocky Mountains? I don't know. The Federal Express? Amazon? I don't know. Okay, so here, did they survive the winter only because of the Mandans? Few historians say that. How could they have gotten across the Rocky Mountains, the Bitterroots, without horses? Absolutely could not have. I don't think anyone disagree with me, just yell out. Without the guide of old Toby, your dog Toby in your office, we joked about that today, right? Old Toby is the Shoshone man that led them. Even he got lost for a day or two. They were lost. They nearly died. They were eating some of their horses. The horses were just about to die. They made it through. I've already mentioned the Nez Perce, talked about killing them. What could we save them according to Nez Perce oral history? The Snake River, Columbia River tribes. How many of you know that they ate dogs? Their favorite food was buffalo hump. I think beaver tail was #1, buffalo hump was second, and then dogs. Because out in the Oregon country, they got so sick on salmon and camas root, that's when the Nez Perce were thinking of killing them. They were already almost starving, but they got really sick on camas root and salmon. And so then they started buying dogs. And no reaction? Today, we wouldn't think much of that, would we? ASCPA would. Is that the right? Okay, I digress. See why I need more time? Clatsop and Chinook Indians helped them survive at the coast. Then the encounter with the Blackfeet, probably all of you know about that. 1 death, maybe 2 deaths, fighting over rifles and, whatever. Won't spend much more time on that. Their speeches, Jefferson's your new father. They handed out the sovereignty tokens. Doctrine of Discovery, I'd like to go back. Why'd they build these forts, folks? especially Fort Clatsop. But they almost froze to death in Fort Mandan instead of living in a nice, comfortable earthen house like the Mandan Hidatsas and Arikaras did. Very comfortable. There's one on display down here, replica. They built this fort, flew the American flag, marched military guards, all this stuff, but especially in the Oregon country. Why didn't they live in a 100-foot-long cedar? You guys know about the Chinook Indian peoples that lived at the Oregon coast? They lived in 100-foot-long cedar shake housing. And so why didn't Lewis and Clark live in one of those warm, rain-proof pretty much, and instead they built that horrible fort? Well, because that's what Jefferson told them to do. They were there to actually possess the Oregon country. That's my second element from Johnson v. McIntosh. Lewis's branding iron. He carried a branding iron that says, I was on the board of the Oregon Historical Society for about 6-7 years. They have the branding iron that Lewis carried across the continent. It says U period S period CAPT M period Lewis. Now what'd they use it for? If someone knows better than me, tell me, but I do not think the branding iron is mentioned in the journals. I do not think. I could not find a reference to the branding iron in the journals until they crossed the Rocky Mountains. Now they're in the Oregon country, claimed by Russia, Spain, England, and us. And now they start branding stuff. Now Clark did write his name over by Billings, didn't he? So that's in the old Louisiana territory. Were they doing tourist stuff? Were they tagging? Some people know what that means. Were they doing Kilroy was here? No, that's my generation. They were trying to prove where they had been. When they get to the Oregon coast, the furthest north on the Washington, what's today Washington, Clark, goes with 3 guys. Surely it was Drouillard and the Fields brothers, and they go about 9 miles north, and on a tree he carves Captain William Clark from the United States. I wrote even the date down. December 3rd, 1805. Was he just being a tourist? They were a military expedition, military officers trying to convince the world that the United States owned the Oregon country. Now, you're my jury. We're back to where I was. I'm very close to the end. Here is my number 1 piece of evidence. At trial, counselor, I would blow this up into an exhibit for the jury to look at as long as the opposing counsel allowed me to leave it up. This is what's called the Fort Clatsop Memorial. The day they leave the fort, they leave one of these inside the fort, and they hand, who was it, Cobaway? Wasn't he a Clatsop chief? I'm forgetting, this stuff's from nearly 20 years ago. And they handed several copies to chiefs, and they said, if any white people show up, give this to them. Now, if you don't know this, European and American ships were already coming into the mouth of the Columbia at that time. And Lewis and Clark were waiting, hoping to see a ship. They probably would have liked first-class passage home instead of hiking. One of these pieces of paper almost beat Meriwether Lewis back to the East Coast. Now, you may not know that. So an American ship, the Lydia, showed up in June 1806, and one of these tribal chiefs said, hey, a bunch of white guys were here, and they said to give you this. Here it is. It went to China. It then went to Boston. It arrived in Boston May of 1807. Lewis himself only made it back to D.C. in January of 1807. So had they all perished, this was evidence of what they had done. And this is my trial exhibit that the United States has discovered, occupied, and now should own the Oregon country. So you read that, please. The list. On the back side, they named all 33 people that had gone with them. York, Sacagawea. I hope they listed Pomp, too. Although I guess that would be 34, so maybe they didn't. And then what does that mean? We want some civilized person to see this list. They knew other nations would not believe the Clatsop and Chinook Indians, that there had been some Americans here. So they wanted this evidence, and they wanted some European to see it. That's why they told the chiefs, hand these copies to any ship that shows up. We want the informed world to know that the United States sent us out, we crossed the entire continent, and now we're talking about contiguity and finding the mouth of the river. Look what it says, to the discharge of the Columbia into the Pacific Ocean. That's why I don't know about this vote and if they really would have moved upriver. Jefferson wanted international law complied with. He wanted American occupancy of the river mouth. And that's what Fort Clatsop was clearly, in my opinion, is clearly about. So that's my number one exhibit. Think back to my 10 elements. Quite a few of them were done by Lewis and Clark. I'm getting pretty close to being done. If you didn't know this, I mentioned Robert Gray earlier. He was a Boston private citizen, fur trapper, sea otters. He found the Columbia River first, sailed about 25 miles up it. The Spanish claimed later they knew all about it, they just didn't put it on a map. Well, they made a big mistake, because what's your number one element of the Doctrine of Discovery? You got to tell the rest of the world you found it first. Put it on a map. Put your flag and your cross in it. So I don't know if the Spanish ever really knew of the river. He sails 25 miles up it. Look at the name of his ship. What's the name of the river today? Jefferson knew all about this. Jefferson was Secretary of State. He targets Lewis and Clark at the same identical spot 10 years later. And then I'm sure you all know, okay, so Lewis and Clark. But then John Jacob Astor, this famous American fur trader, what a brilliant man he was. He writes President Jefferson a letter in 1808, and he says, I'm thinking of building a fur trading post on the Pacific Ocean. Maybe at the mouth of the Columbia River. And so I picture Jefferson doing cartwheels down the floor of the White House, and he writes him back a letter, quote, I will give you all the support the executive can provide, period, close quote. He desperately wanted a permanent American occupancy of the Pacific Northwest. Contiguity, the mouth of the river. And so folks, if I'm from Oregon, the town of Astoria is still there today. So you could go visit that and you're living, history. John Jacob Astor, and the Homer Simpson moment, you're gonna go, Homer Simpson? No! So the Canadians had been slowly making their way every year a little further, sea trading. Their famous Duncan Duncan something. Those are Canadians. But they were making their way down, and then he builds Astoria, his port, in May of 1811. Here come, I think in June, maybe July, the voyageurs and the Hudson Bay people are coming down the river, and they hear the ocean. They go, we've made it, we've made it. And then Homer Simpson, they go, what's that American flag? What's this? So the race was on to get there, folks, and we beat them by a month. John Jacob Astor, thank you. Now, I want to tell you folks something. I've done the research when I wrote the book. We argued with England for 50 years who had the best discovery claim to the Oregon country. These are the three things that our secretaries of state, starting with, it hadn't all happened yet, so Jefferson wasn't using that. So it was James Madison, it was John Quincy Adams, it was James Monroe that was always the path to the presidency, it seems like in the early days, be Secretary of State. Letters galore between the English foreign minister and our Secretary of State. And we'd go, we found it first. We went there and built a fort. We built Astoria. They'd write back, Sir Francis Drake was up there in the 1570s. James Cook in the 1780s. Mackenzie went across there, the Hudson Bay, and these letters like little kids, back and forth. So that's why I was doing that, kicking their heels. For 40 years. So to say today that Lewis and Clark, and so I was rereading my chapter today, a lot of historians say Lewis and Clark weren't all that important. They were a little bit irrelevant to American expansion, because you do remember that when Lewis and Clark returned, they were already meeting fur traders going up the Missouri. And they'd look at them and go, well, who are you guys? Oh, I'm Lewis and Clark. Aren't you guys dead? because they'd been gone for 2.5 years, right? So American expansion was ongoing, but to say they were not crucial to international relations is to ignore the documents you can read in the National Archives. And the argument we made, like I say, they argued Hudson Bay, Sir Francis Drake, James Cook, and Mackenzie, etc. We argued these 3 facts. Is that from the Doctrine of Discovery? Absolutely. Okay, we'll cover this very quickly. How did we settle the Oregon Country? I call him JQ, John Quincy Adams. When he was Secretary of State for 8 years, he signed a treaty with Spain in which Spain agreed to contain its discovery claims to the 42nd degree of parallel south. Guess where the 42nd degree of parallel is today? The Oregon-California border. A couple of years later, he signs a treaty with Russia. They withhold their claims from the 53rd or 54th degree of parallel north. Guess what that is? The southeastern tip of Alaska. So all that was at dispute was us and England. And we apparently claimed we were going to go to war. Of course, like a good politician, Polk was just talking. We signed 2 treaties with England to share the Oregon Country in 1818, 1827, and then Polk, 1 year, I suppose, after he's president, we divided at the 49th degree of parallel, where it is today. Oregon Territory Act, Oregon Donation Land Act. The United States starts giving away Indian lands before we even signed treaties with Indians. I am certain they were hoping Indian peoples would all die of diseases. And when they didn't, then the United States signed treaties with tribes, reservations, opening enormous areas of the West for American settlement. I think I have one more thing. This is not my definition of manifest destiny. I should have asked you in advance, what does that mean to you? We hear that word when we're in grade school and stuff, but what is it? This is what historians say American manifest destiny is. We're special, our institutions are special, we have a mission to remake the whole world, and we're doing it under God's divine direction. The religion aspect back in play, Doctrine of Discovery, Johnson v. McIntosh. Do you know where the phrase comes from? John O'Sullivan is a New York editor, newspaper editor. He used the words first in July of 1845 that America owned Texas because it was our manifest destiny. God meant it to happen. In December 1845, he writes this about the Oregon Country. I guess I'll turn around to look at it. Isn't that about 6 of my 10 elements? Our legal title, as far as law exists, is perfect. International law, he's talking about the popes, he's talking about Spain and Portugal, he's talking about that line of demarcation, he's talking about the English charters, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right of discovery, woo, exploration, yeah, settlement, continuity, that's my contiguity, and then he throws in an et cetera. So, first time I ever saw that, about we're crazy. So manifest destiny. So a long chapter in my book is then tracing how I argue that those 10 elements of the Doctrine of Discovery became American manifest destiny and really what we mean by it today. This is the last slide, folks. I hope, if you haven't seen this painting before, it's pretty famous. 1872. Look at the fleeing. There's so much going on in this painting. The Indians fleeing in terror from the wagon trains. There's the buffalo fleeing in terror. More Indians way at the top, more wagons way at the top. Whoever this is supposed to be, I don't know really. Is it an angel? I read last night online more about this. They sort of made fun. They said, hey, without any straps or Velcro, her dress stays up. That's kind of a provocative dress. I started looking at it once I read that. Velcro, I don't know anything about Velcro. So anyway, there comes the Wells Fargo. Where's the Pony Express guy? I thought, yeah, there's a Pony Express guy. And then there comes she's carrying the telegraph wire. So look, and there's the miners and there's the farmers. And the Indians, well, here's the wild animals. What did George Washington say? The animals retreat from our advance, so it is with the savages, the savage as the wolf. So I don't want to end on a downer. Wow. Tribes got involved with the Lewis and Clark expedition. At first, I didn't know that any would. The 500-year anniversary of Columbus discovering America, no tribes were involved in that at all. And they did not want to hear any word celebration. So the National Bicentennial Commission heard Indian people, and they never used the word celebration. They called it a commemoration. And so they listened to the circle of tribal advisors. And if they wanted any tribes involved, the tribal people, including me, we said, we're here to deliver our message. We're not here to glorify these guys that were part of, you know, what do you want to call it? Ethnic cleansing? What do you want to call George Washington's letter? Both being beasts of prey. I mean, so now, boy, I'm getting real dramatic. You know, I used to be a minister, so not only was I a used car dealer, hellfire, no. Anyway, I should stop. It's been way too long. Any questions? I would love to hear what you want to ask. Sir.
Well, I think I have two. One, is there any speculation if Lewis and Clark had taken a ship and gone the long way around where the Cape Horn, I guess, yeah. And
We got hot questions coming our way. No, I've not heard about any speculation about if they'd have gone back by a boat.
because the Spaniards, who were, hostile to their exploration anyway, might have taken the journals, thrown them in the ocean, and just...
I think even if they'd have found a ship, they were sending a second copy home by overland. Anybody remember anything? I think a few guys were going to have to walk it no matter what. Those guys were really smart, and they knew about these kind of issues.
One more thing. All these conferences they had, the hundreds of, I think they smoked at every one, right?
Well, you got to smoke the peace pipe.
So, this has always been a question no one seems to have answered, that when they were in Astoria, they were so desperate for tobacco to smoke, they took out the dottle, the tar of their pipes, and would smoke that. So on the way back, though, they started smoking with the Indians again, and there's even some suggestion they used their own tobacco. But what was Indian tobacco? Every Indian seems to have used tobacco.
Well, the Pacific Northwest, it's so wet, I don't think it could grow. It was so cold, I don't think it could grow. Yeah, I have no special knowledge on that.
The Blackfeet have a type of tobacco that grows up in the Rockies that we use. And it is a tobacco family plant, but looks nothing like tobacco from back east. So there were plants that they smoked.
Was there nicotine in Indian tobacco?
Did they call it kinnikinnick, or is that just
Well, kinnikinnick is an additive to the tobacco.
to tobacco?
Yeah, and so, I don't know, I'll ask them. I know because the plant still grows, if you know where Looking Glass is up by Glacier, it grows along the south slope of that little hill there. Yeah.
Other hands? I thought I saw some, sir.
How many journals were there? Any idea?
You mean volumes?
Yeah. How many?
In the Moulton set, there's 14 separate books, but so what do you mean by volumes? Separate copies?
How many journals did Lewis and Clark copy? They were supposed to make many copies, right?
Oh, I do not know the answer to that.
Okay.
Pardon? Oh.
They were instructed.
It's
make
hard
many
to say
copies.
because
Tell me about the privates.
Sergeant Praeger should have had a journal. We've never found it. George Shannon went on to become a lawyer. He should have had a journal. We've never found it. So it's hard to say.
Well, the two captains and the sergeants were ordered to write journals, so there only should have been the 7 writers, but you...
Yeah, but White House kept a journal, possibly Fraser, and so we don't know because some of them just disappeared.
Well, the two captains kept field notes in a elk skin bound thing, right? And then at nights when they would write it into those red things I got to hold that were a funny shape, only about 3 inches wide and about that long? Yeah, and they opened like this. And when the librarian stuck that in my hand, I just couldn't believe it. But yeah, the number, I don't know. Other questions?
Yeah, I got one. Just read recently about a boat that Francis, and he was going to nullify the Doctrine of Discovery.
Repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery.
Is that, what's going on there?
Native peoples have been asking the Vatican since about the 1970s to withdraw those papal bulls that I referred to and the ones from 1436 about the Canary Islands. So finally, Pope Francis, 2 departments called dicasteries of the Vatican. So this didn't come from the Pope himself even. It came from these 2 departments of the Vatican. March the 30th, big news. New York Times called me that day, woke me up in the morning. I go, what do you call me for? The Pope withdrew. I go, okay, yeah, that's fine, you can call me. So anyway, I think I was on the front page of the New York Times. I can die happy. But what they said, yes, they repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery. They say it's never been church doctrine. We're not responsible for it. It was a legal and political tool. And I think that in one sense they were maybe referring to me and other people I know. They go, some scholars have claimed the Doctrine of Discovery came from these papal bulls. Well, I wrote that in 2006, but other people had written that before me, so I'm not claiming that. But it's just kind of funny to see they go, some stupid scholars, and I go, well, that's me. But anyway, and you had a hand up.
Yeah, Counselor, just with the theory of the federal government retaining the right for the tribes to not be able to sell the land to a foreign power, has that right been extended to current days with people selling land to the Chinese? Since we stole the we bought the land fair and square from other folks, does that non-right continue on so that I can't sell my land to the Chinese so that they can spy on Malmstrom Air Force Base, for example?
Well, I don't know anything about this reference to the Chinese, but didn't you just mention that today at lunch? Florida or something. Okay, so I don't know if you're asking about that, I know nothing about that. But you own the fee simple absolute title to your home. You can sell it to anyone you wish, right? For any amount that you can negotiate. That's when we take property law in law school, we talk about the rights, the bundle, the sticks in the bundle, don't we? And there's 4 famous rights when you're the fee simple owner. And number 1 is to sell your land to whomever you wish for whatever amount of money you can get. Give it to your kids for free if you want. It's your right. But tribes don't have that right. The feds are in charge. The feds are the legal owner. Tribes the beneficial owner. The United States is supposed to manage the land for the benefit of the Indian peoples or the Indian nation. That's what when we say the word trust lands, that's what we're referring to. And that certainly sounds like the preemption element, number 3, from Johnson v. McIntosh.
So I can keep Dugan from selling land to the Chinese, but I can't keep Mr. Gable from selling his land to the Chinese.
I guess if you own trust lands, but if he owns trust lands and the United States agrees, he can sell it to whomever if the United States agrees. But see, most tribes don't want to sell their land, so that's not much of an issue. But I mean, I worked for tribes. To develop your land, you got to get permission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It might take 2 years to get permission to build a house. I did a lot of Indian housing work for Northern Cheyenne right here in Montana. I worked 3 years for Northern Cheyenne Housing Authority. And we couldn't do anything without the permission of the BIA because the United States is the legal owner. But it's different from what your question. Was that a hand by you?
Yeah, there was.
Well, I thought you had a question. I want to answer your question.
My question.
You laughed at all my jokes.
They were funny jokes.
Thank you. Folks, did you hear that?
So, if a tribe elects self-determination.
Sorry.
Tribe elects self-determination, and they come out from under the umbrella of trust relationship with the federal government. That doesn't change their rights for how they manage their lands and whether or not they want to sell their lands?
Doesn't change the selling of the land. He brought up a new policy under federal Indian law, and tribes can apply to be governed, if you want to use that word, under the Self-Governance Act from 1994 and the Hearth Act from 2012. Tribes can make their own decisions these days on who they lease their land to if they first get permission from the Secretary of Interior to do that. They have to draft specific regulations that the Secretary of Interior has to approve. But once a tribe does that, they can lease their own lands under their own codes. So the feds are now allowing that. And that's called the Self-Governance Act. Question online.
Yeah, I apologize. There was a question on Zoom about that you actually touched on a little bit earlier. It was the Doctrine of Discovery. In March 2023, the Vatican, Pope Francis, formally repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery, a legal concept based on the 15th century papal documents that European colonial powers used to legitimize the seizure and exploitation of indigenous lands in Africa and the Americans, among other places. What implications might that have for the future?
Zero. If you want to read my editor, let me, they say it won't go backwards.
It's probably because you went to the end.
Well, let's see if it'll start over. Well, it's frozen now. I'd like you to see my SSRN webpage. I have about 65 articles on there you can get for free. This Doctrine of Discovery has become a full-time occupation for me. In 2011, I wrote an article about how Spain applied the doctrine in Chile, and that same year, an article about how Portugal applied the Doctrine of Discovery in Brazil. In 2022, I came out with an article how the Europeans carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1885, folks. And I had done the research 12 years ago when I was still at Lewis and Clark, and so it's a kind of funny story to me anyway. So I met a student at Arizona State who was from Austria, fluent German. So I said, well, why don't we write an article about how the English and the Germans divided East Africa? She was willing, so she did all the German language research. I did the English stuff. And I opened my notes from 2011, and I had written at the top, I will never finish this article. Because I knew I needed a German speaker. And I had 160 pages of notes I'd already taken. So thank God for Olivia Stitz and her being born in Switzerland or in Austria. Anyway, I don't think I answered the question at all. But the Pope's power these days is zero, isn't it? But what they're ignoring, they ignore that in the 1400s, popes could excommunicate world leaders. And world leaders were terrified of that. And so those papal bulls in the 1430s, and what did Pope Alexander do when he divided the world? That had enormous, we're back to my title, enormous geopolitical impacts. What is the Pope's influence today? Probably zero. And I want to repeat for the person on the audience, the Pope didn't really repudiate it. What the Pope did was disavow any responsibility for it. So can you get me back to the opening slide? Because if the folks are interested, this editorial that I wrote the Vatican repudiates the Doctrine of Discovery - maybe? With a question mark. And it's about 800 words or 1,200 words with more links than you need. But if you can just, yeah, that's what I was trying to do. But you're smarter than me. So this is called SSRN. If you don't know anything about SSRN, Social Science Research Network, there are 3 million articles there by 800,000 authors that you can word search, and it's free. Right there. So that's my author page number, and I have 62 or 65 pieces on there. And so if you're interested in this, I saw some people nod their heads about Africa. The research about how the Europeans as late as 1885 were using most of my 10 elements to carve up Africa. And I got to tell you something that's funny. Why was I interested in this? The Berlin Conference ran from November 1884 to February 1885. There were 13 European countries that went to it, and the United States. And my interest was, why was the United States at the Berlin Conference as European countries were deciding how to carve up Africa? And so once I then had the time to do the research and read the notes, and I saw what the American, I don't think ambassador is the right word, but the American representative, he was giving them speeches on how the U.S. had colonized Indian nations and was telling them these are tribal peoples in Africa. Okay, I'm expanding now. He wasn't as bold as I am. He was a little more circumspect, but he was plainly there to help advise Europeans on how to colonize, an entire continent of indigenous nations. So if you're interested in that, that's a 60-page article. You can read that, if you can't fall asleep. But first, we got to buy some books. If I have to carry these back, I sell these at my cost, $15. And if I have to carry those back to Portland or Phoenix, I live in both places. It's going to hurt my back. So please help me out here. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me here. Thank you. Yes, sir.
All my life, people have asked me, how do you fix the reservations?
Ooh.
Right? And I know that when I read the end of your book, and talked about how does this help tribes, is that we need to change laws, but the laws need to be changed in a very specific way. You almost need a think tank, it kind of felt like you were saying about how, if you change one of these laws, how does it affect all 576 tribes across the country? Listening to you tonight, with you guys, with a lawyer, I might need you to talk to my next friend. Could I just send him your information and say, how does this, how do you fix the reservations? Well, it's one law at a time. Is that the answer?
No,
We gotta
is
get-
it okay if I make a joke? Now, I don't know your billing rate, but I charge 100.
Yeah.
No, my third book was on reservation capitalism with quotes around capitalism. That's why ASU hired me, was to teach economic development. And just to tell you folks, I don't know if any of you are from Rocky Boy. This Rosette is Rob Rosette, and he's from Rocky Boy. He's regrettably passed away last year. But his law firm, he does nothing but Indian law work. So economic development, education, we're talking about sort of like what do you do about the inner cities, right? You're talking about entrenched poverty, policies that were designed to crush you down. Why did I show you folks the George Washington letter? What has been American policy towards the natives until about the 1970s? Richard Nixon changed the policy about natives in 1970. And the words you used, Nixon coined that, self-determination. Nixon gave a speech and wrote a law review article in 1970 and said we should stop telling Indians what to do and we should listen to them and assist them. So that is the goal behind self-determination. Tribal peoples make their own decisions. How long will that take to get out of a condition that is unspeakable? Some tribes are doing better than others. Some have an asset, timber, minerals, good farming. Today, casinos work for some tribes. I'm from Phoenix, where there's 3 tribes right there. $300 million a year the Salt Rivers take in, that's gross. $200 million a year Gila River takes in. Fort McDowell about the same, and Ak-Chin. So you have 4, so location, location, location. But gaming can't be the end-all be-all, right? Someday that may lose its luster. Someday the feds could make it illegal. So I preach private sector economy, development on res, spend our money, you need to have me back on that talk. The multiplier effect, spending your money in your own community is how you build wealth and keep money there. I worked at Northern Cheyenne. Every person that got a check, first off, there wasn't even a bank. And so what do? In the car, 42 miles to Hardin, Montana, or 102 miles to Billings. I watched that for 3 or 4 years. There was nowhere to spend any money, hardly. There was the IGA little grocery store, and there was the chicken shack that I was afraid to eat in. And for lunch, you went to the tribal college. And so where's the multiplier effect, folks, if you don't know, is the goal of economists is to keep a dollar in your community 5 to 7 times. You surely know all about this. And you know about the brain drain. A small community like this, the kids go off to Missoula, to college, or dare say a bigger school even, and do they come home? So you and I know what happens on reservations. There's not much to do maybe. And so you see bright lights, big city, and you don't come back. I was on a committee with the Navajo Nation for 3 years, economic development stuff, and they have more attorney jobs than you can imagine. They can't get anyone to take them. You know why? There's no place on the res for them to live. There's no middle-class housing. There's poor HUD housing for people 80%, boy, I'm giving a whole nother talk. 80% below adjusted gross income is how you get HUD housing, Indian HUD housing. So it's an incentive not to work. Because if you get income, your rent goes up, or they make you move out of the tribal housing, and you look around, there's no middle-class housing to buy or rent. So there's a lot of things we need, but boy, it starts with, some steps.
I know nothing about this, but if the tribes are given self-determination, can we eventually get rid of the BIA, let the tribes act just like every other citizen?
That's probably what Nixon was thinking. Sometimes if I want to put parties in, you know, Indians themselves, tell me if you've heard this. Indians say the Republicans have better ideas, the Dems give more money. So there's a bit of Richard Nixon is why they think Republicans and the self-determination. But now I almost lost track of you. I mean, the goal is to just bring living standards to what word should I use? Not normal's not the word I meant to use, but up to the standard for all Americans, you know. So that's my passion. My dad owned his own used car business for 50. I was not joking when I said I used to sell used cars. My dad owned his own used car lot for 52 years. Both my parents were desperately poor, came from the Dust Bowls, Oklahoma and Missouri. And I worked for my dad for 19 years before I went to college even. So I don't know where that went. Sorry. I was born in a cabin my father built. No. Sorry, I went off the rails there. Thank you all. That's a whole nother talk. Thank you all.